About me. Today we're going to be discussing citizen science. And I am almost a doctor. I've submitted my PhD at the University of Western Australia and it's currently being examined. So hopefully it'll come back soon and I'll be a doctor. To give you an idea of how I've got into shark research, I've got just my qualifications just to give you an idea, as I imagine some of you are considering university. I've got a Bachelor of Applied Science in Ecology. This is from the University of Queensland, my education. Bachelor of Arts in Chinese, which was a bit of a sideline. Bachelor of Science in Honours, where I looked at shark and ray vertebrae, which was very interesting, sort of working from the inside out of sharks. And as I said, I've just submitted my PhD basically on oceanic sharks, where they like to live, how that changes over time with climate change, and whether their numbers are changing. So a lot of statistical modelling in that. So I'm obviously a marine biologist. I do a lot of science communication. I host a radio show, and I've actually just finished an internship with the BBC's Naked Scientist. And in that, we produced a shark show. So you can have a listen. There's a lot of research in that as well from other researchers. But moving right on, today we're talking about citizen science. So put your hand up if you have an idea of what citizen science is. Okay, so not many hands up as yet. But it's basically, just because you're not a scientist, it doesn't mean that you can't contribute to science. Citizen science is also known as community science or crowd science, and it's when scientific research is conducted by the community, basically people like you. And recently, it's really come into its own. Put your hand up if you have a smartphone. You all have a smartphone, I almost guarantee. So that means you can contribute to science. And also people with underwater cameras, basically anyone with a computer can help science using citizen science. It's basically getting the public involved. And there is a variety of projects out there, everything from looking at viruses, and especially now with COVID going on, a lot of people are helping with that. In fact, every time you scan in, some of that data could possibly be used in the future. It's also been used to map the human brain, discover new galaxies, discover new species, and even find out where animals travel to, where they migrate. So it's basically a partnership between individuals and scientists, and it basically gets us more data than we can't necessarily get ourselves, because research is expensive. You have boats, you have time for people, you have skippers, you have the actual tags and everything you use as well. So if we can get you involved, it not only helps us, but it helps you as well. It gets you involved in the scientific process. I mean, who wouldn't like to be on a boat for the weekend? Put your hand up if being on a boat is your idea of a good weekend. Yeah, I think that's most of us. Maybe not this weekend with the weather the way it is. And so there's a variety of projects, but today we're going to talk about marine biology projects, because basically I'm a marine biologist and that's sort of what I do. But why do we need citizen science? There's a lot of threats to the oceans at the moment. There's climate change, there's overfishing, there's pollution, there's a lot of noise around, there's a lot of things that we have to look into. And basically by getting you involved, it can help us do this on a global scale. As I said, everyone with a smartphone can contribute. So it really is a great asset. In fact, this decade has been called by the UN the Decade for Ocean Science for Sustainable Development, basically the science we need for the ocean we want. So there's a real push at the moment to get more science out there. And it's a really good way if you want to look into this. There's hashtags, it's on social media as well, and you can see if there's actually ways you can get involved in this decade of ocean science as well. So it's all around the world, it's global. You can see that there's local projects, regional projects, and you can see that Australia has quite a few. We'll go into them in a bit more detail. So basically, if anyone wants to get involved anywhere in the world, there's a lot of things that you can do to help. And that little GIF moving across the screen is a diver with Paddy's Project Aware. How many of you are certified scuba divers? Put up your hand. Okay, so there's actually a lot of things that you can get involved in as well. And if you look at the number that we have in Australia, there's quite a few, and some of these are actually local as well. And this was a paper that came out in 2019, a scientific study, and they found that there's over 16,000 registered participants. And this was sort of local projects. It wasn't ones that had international reach. So you could actually get in your local neighborhood and help discover things around there. And again, this is Project Aware that Paddy runs, the diving association, and they have lots of ones around the world, including Australia as well. And as an example of the projects that you could actually do, this is the Internet of Turtles. You can go on there and have a look, and that's all around the world, not in Australia at the moment, but they have 42,000 sightings and 113 nests. So by getting this information that's provided by the public and people like you, it can really help conservation and with management plans. By knowing where these nests are, by knowing where these animals go, we can really help protect those areas. So that's what it is. And here's an overview of projects that are around and that you can help. Have you put your hand up if you recognize at least one of these projects? Leave your hand up if you have actually contributed to any citizen science project. Have any of you? Okay, leave your hand up if it's River Guardians. No, I wish I could ask you which ones it is. Put your hand up if you've contributed to Red Map.
So just to jump in, it's all part of the Wild Book with Dr. Norman with the whale shark photo. So in year 8 or year 9, they all took part in doing some of the spot photo ID and raise money for a satellite tag in the whale shark race around the world.
The world.
Yeah, all with Eco Oceans. I
know, Brad. Thank you. I'll stop asking all the questions then. Actually, that one's not on here, but there are quite a few. And you see that there's a few with Wild Book. We've got the whale sharks and the leopard sharks. But even if you're not into animals for some reason, there's also king tides. You can go out and see the tides and take photos of them. So a lot of this is updating photos. But as well as that, I just want to emphasize that zeros are valuable data as well. In fact, in some of the work that I do, we basically look at where sharks are. But to look at where they are, you also need to know where they are not. So if you don't see something, it's also very valuable data that you can still contribute. And you could contribute that data. Here's an example. I know that you guys have done some citizen science, which is great, but there's different ways of doing it. And this is how another organization does it. They basically have instructions there, if you can see them, that you download their data sheet and then you fill it in, then you upload it again. And they also emphasize the value of zeros. So you can do that after every dive or every snorkel. And it's a very easy way to get your data in there. And in fact, I've used a bit of citizen science data in my work, and it's really valuable. And we'll often let you know if you're interested about where your data has been used, because it's beneficial for all of us to know where it ends up. So let's talk about whale sharks. You guys probably know this already. They are a bit of the poster child when it comes to citizen science. And that's because they have uniquely patterned features. And this can be used to identify them. With other animals, as you may know, for example, whales, you can use their fluke or their tail. Other species of sharks, like white sharks, you can use their dorsal fin, the fin on top, and you can identify them. And so you take a photo of the area, and then you submit that photo. And don't be too worried when you submit the photo, because there'll be a researcher that will look at it and they will double check what you've written and verify it. So basically anything you put in there is helpful. They will verify that and then they'll match it. They will actually match it in the computer using sophisticated software. And it'll either come out with an individual that has been seen before, and that way we know that it's coming back to the area, which is useful, or it might be a new individual, and often you get to name that. I've actually named a manta ray, which was quite exciting. And then you get to see where they go and you sort of get involved in the scientific process. So that's how it works. And another animal that you might be familiar with is manta rays. And manta rays have a unique pattern of spots as well, but that's on their belly, or their ventral surface. And that doesn't change through their lives. So we can identify that when they come back. And basically all you need for them as well is a picture, a photo of this area. And that goes into the database as well, the same as the whale shark. And the Manta Trust does it, and also Project Manta is on the east coast of Australia, but also on the west coast over here. And they do the same thing, and then they research it, and then you get to see if you've got a new individual, and then you get to name it. So it really is beneficial, and there's a lot of scientific papers that are coming out, and they're actually using this data, and it's data that we might not have in any other way. And have any of you seen a sea dragon when you've been in the water? Yeah, they're often quite hard to spot. I know we often go in there and hope to see one. Well, there's Seadragon search as well, which is a local one. And that allows people to record sightings of the weedy or the leafy sea dragons. And it's similar to the other projects. And you upload your photo, which is sort of around the face of the sea dragon. And the researchers are looking at that, and they're making a lot of new discoveries. And on the side with the GIF there from the WA Museum, they've actually discovered a new species called the ruby sea dragon due to its bright red colouring. And it's one of only 3 species of sea dragon on the planet. So if you want to contribute to that, it's also through the Wild Book website. And there's a lot of different things you can look at, whether you want the big whale sharks or the mantas or the smaller ones like the sea dragons. So now we know how it works. We need to validate it because it is for science. So back to the whale sharks. Do you think citizen science can monitor whale shark aggregations? Put your hand up if you think it's accurate enough to be used for scientific research. Yeah, so not 100%, almost. Well, a paper actually looked at that, and this is in 2013. It's in the Journal of Wildlife Research if you're interested. And they actually compiled photographs of whale sharks from researchers that were trained and were doing that often, but also from tourists. They got the data sets from the tourists and compared the two. And what they found was, yes, citizen science is accurate enough to be used to monitor whale sharks. And so this supports the use of publicly sourced data, because a lot of the data they got was actually based on the internet. And more importantly, it's also very useful in areas where tourists are there a lot. And also it helps us because funding is limited, as we went into before. So it's a very important way that you can contribute to science, and it actually does get used. And another criticism of citizen science can be identification. A lot of people think that if you see a shark, it's a shark. How many of you think that you could identify, say, 5 or more species of sharks by vision alone? What about 6? 7? Okay, so we do have quite a few that could. And that, as I said, is one of the criticisms. And in order to test that, in the United States, at the Texas Shark Rodeo, they do catch and release. And so it was a great way to test if they could identify the sharks that they were actually catching. And the results were very promising, that the anglers actually did manage to identify 97.2% of all shark catches, but bearing in mind that they were fishers that were out there often. But they also found that some smaller sharks and certain species were more difficult to identify. So they are highly accurate, and this is a subset of people that are contributing, obviously. But even though there is that margin of error, which is quite low, if we know it's the smaller individuals, or if we know that it is certain species, we can then factor that into our analysis. So the species were, I believe, the black tip sharks that were harder to identify. So basically, if you got those identifications, you would verify them and double check them. So it is something that is still actually very useful. But closer to home, have any of you seen an orca or a killer whale in the wild around here? No? Maybe one or two? Well, there's Project Orca, which is a local organisation, and they study the orcas or the killer whales around. And I was actually speaking to Dr. Beck Wellard, who runs that research. And she was telling me an example straight of here in Perth of Rottnest Island, where when we go out and do research, as I said, it's expensive. You only have so many people, you often have so many boats, and you have to divide your time into certain areas. And you can only be in one place at one time. So if you're in, say, Bremer Canyon looking for killer whales and there's some in Ningaloo, you can't get there. But with citizen science, you can get photos. And Dr. Wellard was actually saying that members of the public have provided consistent photos of orcas on Rottnest Island to the point where they had long-term data sets from a couple of years now, and they could identify the individual that was there, and they found their family groups that they could put them together due to photos and videos from these contributors. So the data you contribute does have really effective outcomes for these species that we might not have otherwise, and it does actually translate to real research. And how can you get involved? Have any of you heard of the Atlas of Living Australia? A few of you have? If you go online at ala.org.au, you can access citizen science data. You can see the data sets that they have, and you can also contribute yourself. So it's basically a big repository of all this data. Some of it has been verified. If you're going to use it, I'd recommend that you map it first. So you map the data that you download, that you select, and then you see if it's in the areas where you expect it to be. You look at the seasons, you look at the times, you look at the dates, and if any of them are a bit erroneous, you can sort of check. And then you can sometimes verify photos on some of these databases as well and make sure what you're looking at is actually correct. And it's a very valuable resource if you're interested in this at all. And it can also be used to enhance awareness of what's out there and again, to help conservation. Another repository that I think that you're already aware of by the sounds of it is Wildbook. And although we've been talking about marine here, there's also a lot of terrestrial ones. It's got zebras, which wouldn't be, you imagine, easy to identify due to their stripes. Whisker Book, the carnivores, the skunks and lynx. And so there's a lot of different things that you can look into. And obviously there's the shark ones that we've talked about, Manta Matcha, Fluke Book. And I'll end on that. And here's my references if you like to look them up. And I'm very happy to take any questions that you have, bearing in mind it is a Friday afternoon for you.
Can you see us, Charlotte?
Yeah, I can see the back wall. Yeah.
So you said
yes,
there were orcas around Rottnest, was it?
Yes.
So how frequently do you come on orcas? Is it seasonal, or do they just come and go whenever they want to?
A bit of both. Actually, I was talking to Dr. Wellard yesterday, in fact, and she was actually talking about specifically Rottnest, and they are seasonal. I know that they do research in Bremer Bay, and they're fairly frequently, but also they go up to Ningaloo. I would recommend you look at the Project Orca website, which is Project ORCA, and they have a lot of information on that, and they do heavily use a lot of citizen science. And yeah, you could volunteer with them, or they would have their data out there. They've actually just got a paper that came out this week looking at DNA of killer whales around Australia. Do you know that they have, I believe it's 4 different subspecies or groupings of orca? And they actually have different diet, they have different techniques, different hunting specialties, and they actually have different dialects. They're not as cool as sharks, of course, but yeah, Project Orca is your place to look at and get more information on that.
How long did it take you to like nearly complete your PhD?
To nearly complete my, to actually do my PhD or my career going through university? My PhD, this one took me about almost 4 years. I submitted in April, the 1st of April, because I wanted to submit on April Fools, but I think it just makes me the fool. And I'm still waiting to get examiners' comments back. So we're going to be looking at every bit of 4 years. So it takes a while. And if you do any sort of field work, you've got to just account for the time that will take, because the weather doesn't cooperate. You've got to get ethics, you've got to get permits. But yeah, I'm happy to discuss things like that if any of you are interested in taking this career track. I would highly recommend it, but it's a lot of work. And it's not all swimming and snorkeling and taking down data sets, I'm afraid.
Oh yeah. So now you've done your PhD, like, do you have any more like goals or like anything else you want to achieve like soon? Ambitions?
Yes, I would like to do more research on sharks, definitely. And I've got some new communication initiatives coming out. So there'll be a lot more communication as well. And definitely looking more into the pelagic or open ocean sharks, like blue sharks, oceanic white tips, the ones that I looked at, the makos. We're less familiar with them, and I was looking at where they are and why they're there, which is pretty basic knowledge that we need. And to learn more about these, because the oceanic white tips are critically endangered. They've had over 90% declines, and a paper came out earlier this year saying that they've had oceanic sharks in general have had over 70% decrease in the last, I believe it was 50 years. So they really need our help, and the best way to help them is to learn more about them. So I definitely like to do more research on that and learn more about them, and to do more of this communication.
I was wondering how sharks hear and what your favorite shark is.
My favorite shark is a tricky one. It's probably a lemon shark, because that's the first shark I ever tagged. But I have a soft spot for the makos, because they're the Ferraris of the ocean, and they just zoom around like this guy. And shark hearing, that's really interesting. There was a PhD done by a friend of mine, Lucille Chapuis, Chapui or OIS, who actually looked at shark hearing. And we're still learning a lot about that. Can they hear? Yes. Do they use sound? Perhaps not in the way that we think of it. As you know, they have the extra senses like the lateral line, and they sense things differently than what we do. But I would highly recommend looking up Lucille's papers. I think she's got a couple out this year as well, and that will give you more understanding of that. But it's not my specialty, I'm afraid.
So basically we've been told like most sharks have like a significance in like an ecosystem or like their food chain. Do you know if there are any like sharks that have more of like a negative effect on like the overall ecosystem?
Not really. If you think about an ecosystem as a spider's web or a house of cards, or even the pillars holding up a bridge, everything in nature that's naturally there is in a system and is balanced. One thing, it's a food web, not a food chain. One thing is connected to another is connected to another. So everything that's naturally meant to be there has its place and doesn't necessarily have a negative impact. It's when we get involved and start removing things like overfishing, or start adding things like excess noise or pollutants or shipping lanes, and that's when it can become an issue. But in their natural environment, sharks regulate ecosystems, as you've obviously heard. They do have their place. And we're only now finding out what happens when we remove them. So there's not really a negative. Anything that's in the place it's meant to be is fulfilling a role, sort of an ecological niche in that area. But that's a good question. By the media, you'd think that they were always where they shouldn't be and they're terrible, but that's not actually the case. Though I have to admit, I am very biased.
One last one from me. I know it's a bit topical, but what do you think about the state's approach to shark attacks through drum lines and things like that? And do you have an idea, what do you think would be the best way forward to kind of keep everyone happy, or maybe what do you think is like the best kind of solution for this situation?
It's a very complex situation. And one of the things that we're pushing for at the moment is to change the phrasing. Instead of shark attacks, to shark interactions. It's not as if you're going to your local supermarket or your local, well, not a bar, obviously, your local supermarket, and there's a shark there lurking, waiting to attack you. It's not that they're out to get us. If there were, you actually couldn't go to the beach. They're supreme predators. They're very good at what they do. And if they wanted to eat us, you couldn't go in the water. They have a place in the ecosystem. They're apex predators, though Dr. Wellard would argue that orcas are apex predators because they can take out sharks. So that's another discussion you can have. As opposed, there's no simple one-step solution. And as far as making everyone happy, that is a very difficult thing to do. We've got to keep the environment in mind. We've got to keep the fact that people do use the beaches in mind. There is a fishing community. People eat seafood. It's a very complex issue, and it's something that we have to look a lot more into to get the answer. But we are making incremental steps in getting a much deeper understanding, which will definitely help in the future.